Ladies and gentlemen, this is a Friday in May. I don't know the date. Michael Martin, do you know today's date?
It's the 19th. It says it right here on my computer.
Oh, is there a?
There's a little thing at the bottom of the screen.
It's great. I just kind of revealed like a lot about my personality. My father was, welcome to the Regeneration Podcast. What Michael and I are doing today is we're celebrating. We'll talk about why the exact anniversary is a little bit elusive in some ways and a little bit. We're going to do our first anniversary episode. We haven't prepared too much, but just kind of regrouping and doing a stock taking. But the fact that Michael had to tell me that the date's on the bottom of my computer, people over the course of the years, Michael, might have gotten to know our personalities pretty good. And I'm born of German stock and Irish stock. My dad was German, my mom was Irish. And my German dad just did not understand me. And I remember one time, my mom would come home with the groceries, and maybe the gospel passage about those who said they'd do it and wouldn't do it, and those who said they wouldn't and did. I was pretty good. She'd say, "We got to get the groceries out of the car." And I'd get up. We'd be watching, my brother and I, the wide world of sports on afternoon on Saturday. But now they call it ADD. I've never been diagnosed, but I've always been kind of spastic like that. And so I would be just quick to grab the groceries, start putting them away. But my dad would find that I put the gallon of milk in like the pantry. And he would be one of those guys. He would watch me from a distance and notice all these things I did because I had no attention to detail. And then one time, I think he reached his limit with it. And he wasn't mad. He didn't have an anger problem, but he said, "My middle name is Joseph." And he used to call me Mike Jody. And one time he looked at me and he said, "Mike Jody, please do one thing deliberately." And I had no idea what deliberately really meant, but I was probably like 12 and I felt cut to the core, and he wasn't even yelling at me. But that's a little bit about my personality as a youngster. And yeah, I'm not very aware of my surroundings. My office is one of my offices, something of a mess, but not totally a mess. There's an organized chaos. I'm one of those people who can find those papers he needs, even though there's kind of stacks of papers on his desk. Is that your office, Michael?
We'll let the people decide. What can I say?
What do I see?
Actually, it's right now. There's all these coats on the floor because there's a closet in my room where we keep the winter coats. But my wife just took them out of the kitchen. We had them on a coat rack and just threw them on the floor in here. I think she needs to hang them up later.
What are the
Sorry,
books
buddy.
under your phone there?
I know. Christ of the cow. I got a pen with it.
Okay, very cool.
There you hey.
What am I seeing there?
Meditations in the Tarot, the classic, right?
Yeah, I don't know if mine is.
The Liber Usualis.
Okay.
But it's a mess. But
Yeah.
but it's what happened? So now I'm not in the middle of a writing project right now. So when I'm in the middle of a writing project, it's like disaster in here.
Yeah.
Because I have books all over the place and I got my system, which doesn't make any sense to anybody.
You're always
usually after I finish a
Okay.
project, I clean it up.
Yeah. But then I imagine your mind starts kind of dialing in on, and I think this is relevant to today's show, the anniversary show and things, because it's not a vehicle. It's for itself, the regeneration, but you've got your fingers in lots of pots. I have mine and various others. I've known you for many years. You're usually cooking your next book within a month or two of the completion of the last book. I think you're working on Enclosure right now.
Not yet. I'm gearing up for that one. I'm trying to finish this book of poetry, which is my first love. So I'm trying to finish that, which I'll probably be done by the end of the summer. And then I'm going to work on that book, whether it's on Enclosure or I want to do something on the land and the celebration of and not just the celebration of the festivals, maybe have a chapter on that.
Let's talk about the land a little bit. Stay on that, because I've been reading about the land this week. Why do you want to write on the land?
Because it's what I do.
Yeah, right.
I mean, not writing, I mean the land. I mean, so in our relation, and that's why I had a Substack recently on the Druid Stares Back. What did I call it? The Enclosure end game.
Yeah.
Right? But so Enclosure is really interesting to me like that because it's about land use and land use in and the corporatocracy, or the whatever it happens to be at the time in the 15th century, 16th century. It was the government, this England in particular. In Russia, they did the same thing in Russia at the revolution, right?
Yep.
Collectivization of everything.
Like part of original sin that we just do this, right? We want to wall things off.
Well, this is how power works, right?
Yep.
So power work, and we saw this at the beginning of COVID, where the powerful became more powerful, and I include corporations in there.
100%.
The smaller businesses. I mean, how many small businesses went extinct at that time?
Everything. Like on our main street now, all you have is what's left. No more really kind of unique small businesses. They're all service things. You have coffee shops, vape places, tattoo parlors, right? And that's every main street in America now, because those ones that were in the advent of Amazon.com, the small little quaint boutiques and so forth, they were always running kind of a precarious existence since Advent or Amazon. Mm-hmm. And so it didn't take much to push those all out so quickly,
Yeah. Yeah, I was really sad. Like the place I used to buy guitar strings here in Chelsea, Michigan, which isn't too far.
I've been to Chelsea.
So many small businesses that folded in COVID, which is sad to see. Some of them survived surprisingly.
Yeah.
But so many of them folded. But that's, to me, that's enclosure as well, right? Because that's Absolutely. What enclosure did. Enclosure threw people off the land and said, "Okay, you can't do this anymore. Figure it out." And so what ended up is in a early modern enclosure, people ended up having by out of desperation to move to cities and be basically made wage slaves, literally wage slaves, in the Industrial Revolution.
100%.
And that's what they're trying to do right now, I think, with this proposed. And people are not in this country, but certainly in England, it's insane, where they're proposing these 15-minute cities, right?
Right.
That's enclosure. That's enclosure.
Totally.
Right? That's taking the commons away from the common people, right? And the commons in that case being the roads or the ability to travel. Right.
What do you think about I don't think we've talked about like current events too much. But yesterday, in the parish I run, and I'm taking a new job at the diocese running pastoral services. But in the parish I run, there's a migrant center for Mexican, mostly dairy workers and so forth. But the immigration thing that's going on the border, that's partly the result of enclosure, right? I mean, we have a prefabricated script. One would be the more liberal temperament doesn't see any notion of borders, but then the conservative temperament, I think, too narrowly sees like a wall. So at the very most base level, you can see like a door with walls. But on the other hand, we have a problem, which is all these people at our border. But nobody, I don't think left or right, are talking about how huge agribusiness entities, mostly based in America, these old stories, and you might know more than me, but I'm almost going back to my college days. I never went to class, but you'd get these stories that like, the big companies would pay these Mexican farmers to not produce blue corn, but to use these Monsanto seeds or whatever seeds. And then, it exploits the lands and there's no follow-up. And then these people can't make any money. They get wet into agribusiness. Then they're uprooted from their land and they show up at our borders, right? And if we can't at least see this crisis, nobody talks about, so all we hear is about crime, say in El Salvador, there's thugs. Or in Honduras, there's thugs. And I don't claim to have this all figured out, and I hope nobody hears me as lecturing. But there's this other picture too, that like the enclosure and the uprooting of people when agribusiness goes in, and it's what Wendell Berry would call, the boomers versus the stickers. The boomers go in and exploit something like coal mountaintop removal for coal. They go in and then they leave a community bereft. That was equated once famously at Front Porch Republic, maybe by Patrick Deneen, but it could be somebody else, so I don't want to steal that. But it was a combination between a coal removal, mountaintop removal of coal, and the SAT. The SAT comes into a town, gives this test that really is a test for paranoia, right? This is connected, that Father Ed who we had on talking about monasticism here at Geneseo for a while, they were so proud that they had the highest SAT scores, like in the state. And Father Ed, who's a free man and a truly liberal thinker, he had worked in the prisons, and he said the SAT test for paranoia that if you talk to sane people, and if you said like this corkscrew is to that lamp over there as a book is to something else, they'd say like, man, that's a crazy question. And
Not talking shite. Yeah.
Yeah. So the SAT comes into a town, a small town like Livonia, New York, where I live. It takes these people who have one form of intelligence that can probably work for the technocracy, and they take them out, never to return, and then they leave a wasteland. And similarly, what the coal companies do is they come in, extract the coal from the mountain. You have all this water running down and so forth. And I think that combination or that comparison was accurate. But again, in some of these countries, we've done that. Our big businesses have come in and been very extractive and lead a wasteland. And we shouldn't be surprised that these people show up at our borders.
Well, and that's not only that resources like that they extract, but I think they extract intellectual resources.
Absolutely. Right? That's the SAT.
And, and this is the one thing that bothers me about academia. I mean, which nobody ever talks about, right? Because academia, the resources get extracted, and then they're taken out of their environment, right? So you can't get a job where you went to school or where you're from. Yep. So you end up like my son, for instance, Dr. Thomas Martin is in Colorado, right? Yep. That's where he can get a postdoc or you get a job doing what he loves to do. And that's kind of that's destructive of community. I mean, not blaming you, son, but that's part of the kind of middle class cultural assumption that permeates our society that's fucked up.
Yeah,
that we think that's normal. Just like
it's embedded in our language, right? We could look at your son. Go ahead.
Yeah. We were taught to think that both parents working and putting kids in daycare was normal. All the things we were taught to be that were normal, they're abnormal.
Yeah.
They're destructive.
I'm saying it's embedded in our language. Somebody could look at your son and say he was destined to go far, and that's always a compliment, right? Mm-hmm. He's going to go far. How about, yeah. And, here, Geneseo, they closed some years ago, they closed the Department of Speech Pathology. And nobody going to school today, like the college students, again, they don't know that 60s radicalism, always at the university, what was called as progressivism, the first thing it was questioning is the relationship between like the college and the nation state, right? Now we have our students protesting like these different things, but nobody's questioning that nexus anymore. And the other one I've noticed about the university since I've been here is that Geneseo used to be proud of the services it rendered to the local community. It had a speech pathology department because it was training people that could help the local kids with speech disorders. And now they closed that. And then they're really proud of the college union that shows they have, students from 164 member countries or something, and from this far. So even the whole idea that you could have a local college that would take its needs from the local community and piece people who could produce people who could improve the local economy is just gone. It's a million miles away.
It is. Well, and that's the thing is, we accept this bullshit. You know what I mean?
But it's like toads, it's like frogs boiled in water slowly, right?
Question.
But don't you think you could look at some young people, they would never know nowadays that was any other way. Is that right?
Well, they think that's normal. They think even now going to college, people in certain demographics, people think that's you're supposed to do that, and I've been teaching in college for a long time. Guess what? A lot of people in college shouldn't be in college
100%
because they don't really want to be there. They think they're supposed to go there to get a job, or actually what happens more often now, and this is colleges, especially liberal arts colleges that are under threat of closing because of demographic winter. What they do is they add sports teams and give out bogus scholarships, right? So they have an inflated price, which is not really the price, but they say, we'll give you a scholarship that'll take some of that away. So kids go there and they're going to extend their high school sports career a couple more years, right? Like if you're in a Division III school, very few of those kids playing hockey or whatever they're playing there are going to go to the majors, right? Not going to happen.
And I think, those Division III sports, they also have another downside is that if there was, I don't think this whole word that college or the thing used against homeschooling, college helps socialization and homeschooling hurts socialization, all that's so crazy. But on the other hand, working in campus ministry, two things about campus ministry. One is I'm thinking, well, it's both genders, but the parents whose emotional lives were depending on their kids' sports activities. So let's just use the sport of soccer. All of a sudden they come to Geneseo and they're playing Division III soccer, and it gives the mom or dad a reason to keep that one form of helicopter parenting, to keep themselves like their whole, instead of the dad leaving the job that makes him miserable, and kind of growing a pair and doing something and staking out and continuing his or her own growth, they get their emotional needs from their kids' success at sports, and Division III sports kind of leads to that. And so it leads to where, there's always a case where the young kids have to break away in some way from the kind of the grip of their parents. But these emotional bonds through sports, I'm seeing that it kind of prolongs this. It really hurts it. And the campus ministry role, we've mentioned Ivan Illich so often in this show. And by the way, if we didn't make it clear, we're kind of celebrating what Michael and I believe to be a 1-year anniversary of the Regeneration Podcast. But this Ivan Illich, he had a less read essay in a book called Church Change and Development. And I forget the title, but I think it was on the role of the campus minister. And I was graced to read it early in my ministry, is that he saw the campus minister. You're Michael Martin. You've left home. And people said, you're going to go far. You're at a 4-year university. And all of a sudden, you're realizing, wow, my muscles are kind of feeling antsy. I should probably be using them. I think some of my professors are dumb as a box of rocks, but I'm not sure. I mean, they all have PhDs. And then you come and talk to the campus minister, and Illich portrayed the role of the campus minister as that kind of person who creates a bubble for you to question that a little bit and ever so gently force you back into that thing, right? And so my role for 25 years has just been to say, especially with freshmen, like, leave. You're getting into a lot of debt for this if you're not sure.
Exactly. I said the same thing, and I'm bad for business. Oh, hold on a second.
Talk to me.
He didn't mean it. It was a metaphor. That was the DEI director. You said both genders earlier.
Oh, that's right. Thank you.
It's a metaphor, right? Yeah. We got you.
Too funny. So the 1 year into the Regeneration Podcast, what's been some of the joys you found in it, Michael? It was kind of on a whim. Tell the story. Like I would see you're somebody, and you inspired me. You're a doer. So during COVID, we'd had a kind of a thing where we gathered some friends, Tara and Guido and our friend Thomas Jude Germanario. Yeah. We had recorded a couple of things called the Hedge School because we just wanted to start figuring out what we were doing. And that had some pros and cons. And then a few weeks later, that was purely something we videotaped and we might just post occasionally. And then a few weeks later, I'd lost my job at the Abbey due to COVID. And I knew I had some time. So I wrote to you and just said, let's try a podcast, right?
And I'm a joiner inner. So yeah. I mean, it was never anything I thought about doing. I mean, people had mentioned doing the podcast. I'm like, I can't think about this right now, especially running a farm and working however many jobs besides that, the gig economy. But I mean, it's been for me, it's been wonderful. I'm just thinking, we're talking about highlights and stuff. I think after every show, I go away. That was probably the best show we've ever done.
Yeah.
And then I say it the next week, right? You know, and it's interesting. And I like that. What I don't, and this is probably not good as far as the brand goes, because I despise the idea of having a brand. But I didn't want to be like those kind of channels that just do theology and religious philosophy all the time. You know what I mean? Because it just gets dull. And how many times can you say the same thing? So I think what I've appreciated what we've done is bring in stuff that's, of course, we're grounded in philosophy and theology, trust me. But to bring in things from and guests from other disciplines and from other spheres, like a few weeks ago when we interviewed I Draw Slow, the Irish folk band. That was wonderful because it was not our usual thing. And of course we see what else we when we talk. I love even though it was still kind of in our wheelhouse of theology. I mean, the interview we did just last week with Alison Milbank was refreshing. And the thing is, I don't know, and this is probably, like I said, I'm not good at this staying on brand and turning myself into a product thing, but kind of the rule of thumb for me is, and this goes back to my experience as a Waldorf teacher. One of the things I used to always tell the student when I was in teacher training, I would say, if you're not excited about it, no one else is going to be excited about
100%.
Right? So if you go in to teach something that you're not enthusiastic about, forget it. It's going to fall flat. And so, I mean, I think what I've derived in a way is that kind of enthusiasm, the word which means to be filled with the God, right? Which means to be in the moment is what it really means, right? Yep. To be alive to what's right there at the moment. And that's, you see that in teaching where people try to teach from the manual, right? Teach according to the rubric. And they're always dead teachers, right? But that's most of teaching nowadays, right? Where's the rubric? And students ask me in college, Professor Martin, you don't have a rubric. And I'm like, yes, I know. Well, what
the same critique
what
all the time.
What should I do? What should I do in this paper?
Right.
Astonish me. That's what you should do. Astonish me.
Yeah. It's funny that, like, you're probably torn. I haven't taught as much as you. I've taught humanities and a kind of a freshman writing seminar where I used the works of Wendell Berry. And I used to choose the works of Wendell Berry just because I think and maybe this is something I like about the podcast too, that one of the biggest ideological strangleholds we have is these new religions of the left and the right. In fact, yesterday, kind of a segue, I was thinking that when somebody says everything's bad about something, all I know how to do is to look at it. So in Catholic circles, the punchline of every joke is like 70s Catholicism, and the punchline of the punchline is always clown masses. And lately, again, because I'm seeing that, like, kind of just a liturgical piety, a refrain I've made so often on the show is how the few remaining young people in church are probably, a huge percentage are suffering with scrupulosity and obsessive compulsive disorder. And on the other side, you have kind of faceless service, like, I'm going to be on a phone bank for climate change. And then you have people are coming in church, but that's all they see. So regeneration for me is getting that out there. But I wondered, it just occurred to me this morning that this much maligned 70s Catholicism, and there is a certain amount to make fun of, but again, it had a focus on healing. Just healing was a big thing, right? And now we just have like moral codes. But the other one was the church so politically divided? If you look at the Catholic Church today, there's only one theme: the Catholic right versus the Catholic left. And I wonder if, I grew up in 70s Catholicism, and I can laugh at some of it. Some of the songs were insipid, but I can't deny that I kind of liked them as a young kid. But was that just right before this huge to completely new religious tribalism? So here we know our friend Guido Peperata, might have joined us today. He and I have to talk about some other things. His book, The Ideology of Tyranny, and he's not alone doing this, is that the whole divide and conquer thing of like wokeism versus, conservatism is a game played by the elites. He can make that case conclusively. And I wonder if in the church too, that when we look at the left and right, is there some way that like 70s Catholicism is the butt of every joke is so denigrated because it was just prior to the fact that we're all totally separated into the ideological Catholic right? You're a little bit older than me, not to slam you, but do you remember, like, what's your memory of those times? This is a stupid segue, but I've just been thinking about it today.
Well, I was an altar boy.
Not even a segue, it's just a detour, sorry.
For a good portion of the 1970s, I was an altar boy in a Novus Ordo church. But that was still, this 1970s when I was in grade school, that was still the end of that kind of golden period of Catholic education in the United States, where you know, I mean, there were so many Catholic schools in the Archdiocese of Detroit where I grew up. I mean, 300, I think I heard. And actually one of the members of our CSA who works for the education wing of the Archdiocese, and she said it's down to like 5.
Wow.
Maybe 10. I mean, from when it was when I was a kid. And that part of that was, you know, the baby boom, right? There were so many kids, and which was able to at least sustain the, you know, to still be traveling on the momentum of when my mom and dad were kids in Catholic schools in the 1940s and 50s. So that still had the proper amount of inertia to keep going.
Mm-hmm.
But I think what happened with the 70s, the Vatican II liturgical changes, which got uglier as time went on. I mean, I don't think I've ever seen a clown mass, but I was in an urban setting, but I saw some bizarre stuff. I mean, don't even get me going about liturgical dance, which could be so beautiful.
Beautiful.
Ask the Coptic church, right? But it's not. It just looks dumb. But what I think happened is because of that incredible flatness that is often the Novus Ordo liturgy, I often call an infomercial for Jesus, because it, you know what I mean? It's inartistic. It's inartistic. And if you go, and the first moment to a Byzantine liturgy, I was blown away by how beautiful it was, right? And I think that people are attracted to the traditional Latin Mass for the same reason. Well, for one of the same reasons. They want something beautiful and nourishing to the soul, you know, and they don't want, here's an example. So last Friday, three of my kids are homeschooled. One's going to graduate this year, and there was like this end of the year homeschool roundup deal where they had little performances and stuff, and it's held at a Protestant church, 10 miles away. So I went there, and I'd never been there. And I walked into it's called the auditorium, which is where they hold their services. It was the ugliest damn thing in the world. Sure. But you know how it is. I mean, there's nothing artistic about it, nothing beautiful about it. It's just a functional thing. And I think to a great degree that wasn't totalizing in the Vatican II reforms, but it was certainly part of it. And that was part of the gamble on behalf of those who were revising the liturgy to make it more palatable to Protestants.
That was part of it.
To flatten it, right? And so and as Peter Morin said, everybody's church is nobody's church, right? Mm-hmm. And Dorothy Day, you can't get any more radical than Dorothy Day and Peter Morin, and she was a daily communicant in the Latin Mass, right? Right. So it's not necessarily something for neocons.
What do you think about like when we had Paul Kingsnorth on, for example? We both, I think when all of a sudden we found that kind of conversion, that like this kind of, he saw so much and still sees so much, and I really, really, really admire him and his courage and everything. But there was a part of our podcast where he was saying that he started seeing through the environmental movement the idea of like doing concrete things versus just supporting some huge agenda called climate change. And then he finds himself in front of an iconostasis, that a big part of me, and we haven't talked about this in detail. I once wrote an article for your journal about Orpheus and crowds versus community and so forth. But you've probably kind of heard my shtick that like when after the Edict of Milan, when everybody was nominally Catholic, the church had to get into crowd control stuff, right? And whenever we want crowd control, we throw up a proscenium arch of some sort, whether it's an altar rail and iconostasis. And so we call that beautiful. The other day I was reading about St. Francis de Sales. When he was being elevated to the episcopacy, he wrote in his journal that he was going, now the liturgy at that time in one sense was beautiful in Paris, but all he could realize if he was going to be spending more time in divine liturgy is he was going to be saying his rosary beads more. There's no participation. So, and I'm not trying to do a slam dunk, but this kind of like, it's beautiful. And when we talk about Larry Chapp and the Anglican Ordinariate, that early mass, and I totally agree with you on this kind of Protestant thing, and I'm not trying to slam Protestantism, but if we just symbolically for a moment say that obviously, the critique of the Latin mass is like what came before it. But if we symbolically came from something like a circle, we all have, when I talk about OCD relentlessly, almost like somebody who suffers from OCD, like I can't let it go. We could look at Jesus, he knew that Chesterton said, we need a little gold in our life, like a birthday. One day a year we celebrate. Jesus is very aware of the tendency to make all of this world kind of neurotically religious. So he offered a simple blessing over bread and wine and a prayer of thanksgiving. Mm-hmm. And I think that was almost to like neutralize the human tendency to get really weird about this stuff. Anyhow, that when, and I understand it. So the Edict of Milan comes, and shortly thereafter, we start seeing these big kind of churches, and the people who wanted to, so some of it was pacifying the crowds, but showing a table on the auditorium stage, the altar. Mm-hmm. And then, the monks go out to the desert, those people who really wanted to live the evangelical virtues. But now that we're there's very few Christians or Catholics around, I'm not saying we just need to go to church house masses or church house churches like yours. I have no idea. But I think we've been in what's called a watershed movement. So I have this kind of allergic reaction, even when you talked about the Byzantine liturgy. It is beautiful, but are we called? It's not passive, but engage with me on this, because I don't know where I'm going. Well, I know what I'm talking about. I don't know where the Lord is leading us. And it's not just to say we have to gather and just do hippie things, but something like a simple blessing and people gathered and faces and names in this anonymous world is super important to me right now.
Well, I don't think there's one, there's not a formula.
Agreed.
But I think, in my diagnosis, I think that's what draws people to the Latin Mass and the liturgy, and the Divine Liturgy, because they're missing something. They want to have, people want an experience of something sacred, right? And if you're not getting that in your usual church setting, and the thing is, we can also convince ourselves we're getting it when we're not getting it. Right?
Agreed. I think that's a huge part now.
Yeah.
The people, the most holy, that's when we're adding all these words to the Eucharist, right? I've been playing with Eucharist lately. So, my joke has been, I've never met a presence that wasn't real. So what does the word real presence mean? So then I think we should call it the real presence. On the other hand, lately I've been playing around with the words. You can get pretty far if you say the present real, kind of like that. Or a real absence also says something really poetic. But I think a lot of what's going on, and I almost want to go back to our discussion about the land and the underworld, is this thing. We know there's something there, but a lot of what we're doing now is pointing to something that might just be like thou doth protest too much or something.
Yeah, well, I think it's hard to get the big picture when you're inside it. But well, I don't know how, but even those, you could, it's almost like I'm really interested in the Gothic movement of the 19th century, the Neo-Gothics. Remember, a lot of beautiful churches were built in America at that time. But that's also when the pre-Raphaelites and William Morris were active, right? And they were, especially William Morris. In fact, there's a great essay in the next Jesus Imagination on William Morris, on the Household of Things, by Catherine Kuiper, who teaches at Hillsdale College, not too far from here. What Morris is doing in Rudolf Steiner too, they're trying to see how the things in our lives, the common everyday things like the doorways and the wallpaper and the chairs, can be human scaled and have personality, rather than this kind of mass-produced thing that we're going into. I don't know about you, but when I go by and see these subdivisions go up in different places, and you see it's all formula, right? It's all formula. Whereas my house, built in, at least part of it was built in the 1880s or 18 even earlier. I think what happened, there was a log cabin before they built the house. It's just so weird. Nothing fits together. It's doors. Every door is different and unique. There's wainscoting, and every room is different. The floors are made from different species of wood that were lumbered here. When it has more personality, we all have had that experience where you go into a dwelling, right? A dwelling. Isn't that what Heidegger says?
Right.
How can we dwell? And one of the things Steiner and Morris both were pointing to is, what did we lose with mass production?
Yeah.
Right? We lost the sense of the human, right?
Housing is a verb versus like
we're not
buying a house.
Pardon me?
Housing is a verb as opposed to buying a house, right?
Yeah.
Housing yourself was an activity we did. Now you buy a house, all these things.
We're into dwell. And I think going back to what we were talking about with liturgy and stuff like this, whether it's house church, because the thing is, you can turn anything into an idol. Okay. House church can be turned into an idol. The Latin Mass is turned into an idol. The divine liturgy is turned into an idol. And people think, you couldn't, it's holy, it can't be, it's an idol. Trust me. The Eucharist can be turned into an idol, right? And I think Jean-Luc Marion, his perfect analogy that he gives of an icon, and it doesn't have to. I'm not talking, a picture of Mary and Jesus. An icon is that which allows us to cross over into the transcendent, and the transcendent to become immanent. Right. Whereas, and sometimes that same thing we're looking at. So the Eucharist can be an icon, so it can do that to us. But it also can be a mirror that when we look at it, we don't see the Eucharist really. We really see our own desires reflected back to us, or our self-perception. I'm holy now, I'm in the right church, or whatever happens to be. Right? So that talk about the price of liberty is eternal vigilance. That's the real task before us, is how to not fall into idolatry. And ideology is a form of idolatry. So we start off with the Catholic left and the Catholic right, right? That's idolatry. It's absolutely idolatry.
Mystery can be an idolatry, right? That's the big one for me. Like the word mystery and sometimes the word reverence they become idols, even though they're desperately trying to point to something beyond them. They've just become a buzzword that it can be a buzzword for something I don't like. It has no mystery, something that bores me, and when somebody is using the word mystery, it often seems not mysterious to them because it's so controlled. Like they feel like they know it and they've owned the right thing. So it's the way you just use mystery in that language just means that like you're so comfortable with it. It's the opposite of a mystery. We need the saints. We both agree. One thing is what could bring divine liturgy back, and Paul Kingsnorth would agree with us, is then you and I are about this. It's maybe one of our main themes, is if what goes on in the church building has to connect to nature and the seasons, or else it's nothing. It has to connect or it's nothing. And the other one would be those people who say that when the Celtic spirituality, thin spaces, or we're going to have people who just point out to us with conviction, and they'll speak with authority, which is the opposite of power. And they'll say the kingdom is warm over here, when I mentioned John Cowper Powys and so forth, he always thought, and this is true of Illich too, he was obsessed with an image of a weed growing through concrete. And he goes, is this violence or not? Imagine a weed pushing up through concrete and the concrete breaks. And Illich said, is this violence? I've always found that very compelling. But Powys himself would walk around all the streets of America, and he was on a lecture circuit, and he would just, wherever the intersection of like a permanent thing like a stone and living things wrapped around it, he could throw himself in that. And he created a gesture in his late books. That's why I found him so fascinating. Instead of us passively receiving, he came up with a gesture that, when we see these things, we can kind of project ourselves a little way out and kind of embrace those elements. And, I haven't ruled out that like learning those types of gestures, we could do a whole show on it sometime, might not be one of the, without that type of spiritual gesturing, that the mass as passive type thing, which it is for so many people, is just dead, but these are things the first thing what we hear, the listeners will hear both of us saying is we don't have this figured out, but these are some of the most important questions, I think, certainly a huge part of the podcast.
Well, it's interesting. even with, I mean, we talk about participation or non-participation in the Mass. In medieval literature, especially in Arthurian literature, there's a phrase that often comes up where I went to hear, and they went to hear Mass. To hear it. Not, I mean, so it wasn't the kind of congregational participation that we do now, right?
No, that's what I'm saying. St. Francis de Sales. It was a venue in which the elevation was the big deal.
Yeah.
And he could say his rosary beads more.
Yeah.
And so now we talk about the real presence. They've made the reception of the Eucharist, but I've been in employed Catholic Church circles for so long that it's so often, it feels like jargon the way people use it. We have to have the Eucharist, the Eucharist, the Eucharist.
The game show.
And yeah. But you're right. It can just be that.
Yeah, I was thinking about this too. I think this is related to this idea of going to hear Mass.
Belloc used that term in The Path to Rome. He said he was going to hear Mass every day. And what I love about it is he missed it his second day. He made a vow to hear Mass.
It's my kind of vow.
Yeah.
But also like Saint Teresa of Avila, for instance, when she's sharing her experiences of mystical experiences of Christ, she never says, and it took about 2 minutes, or she said it took about the length of an Ave, or the length of a Pater Noster, or the length of a creed. She's measuring everything according to that, which we also knew that yesterday was the feast of the Ascension, right? And this idea of measuring time not according to the clock, but according to a sense of the sacred, but a sense of the sacred that is also participating in time, but not the tyranny of punching the clock, right? Which is a kind of a tyranny.
Yeah. How about you, when you mentioned the land, I want to kind of circle back to that a little bit, is this notion, so one thing we want to do, and people please hear us here, is that I mentioned at the end of last week's podcast, and that Allison Milbank one was wonderful. But if one purpose of this anniversary episode, as it were, is to invite anybody using the comments on the YouTube, or if you're listening to Podbean or podcast, I think we'll see them too. But or listen and then come to the YouTube channel, the Regeneration YouTube channel, and leave us a comment. But things you'd like to hear, subjects that maybe we haven't talked about, maybe even guests. Boy, we've had, I think, both of the ones you sent me in the last couple of weeks. We get a lot of letters, and I won't name names now, but Michael, you received a letter from a biblical scholar who was kind of promoting herself, but I thought it was pretty interesting. I know we have to do a show on Margaret Barker, first of all. Mm-hmm. And then the other one was, it was a Catholic psychologist, and maybe he's listening now, and maybe I'm just kind of forcing the hand that we got to invite this guy on. He was saying that he just thought like what we were doing on the show was so relevant to his practice because we're talking about what it means to be human. So that kind of reframes what healing would look like in a psychotherapeutic context. Right. So these were two I thought interesting.
And also, things. Let me add, Mike, that he suggested we have a beer together.
Yeah, that seems fun.
A virtual beer together. So that's right. That'll be Regeneration Podcast 2.0, day drinking. Yeah,
day drinking. Yeah, but the something I want to do. Can you think of a scholar? There's a guy. His name is R.J. Stewart. He's still alive. Oh, but there's this anthropop you and I have talked about. His name is Stephen Clark. He writes on the Mexican Mysteries, a little known work of Rudolf Steiner. But he's talking about the telluric forces in the American land. And he has this interesting proposition that, so I just, at the beginning of the show, I was looking for something I'd sent to myself, a quote from Rilke. And let's take the microcosm of our own life, right? So I'm going to overgeneralize. The Catholic Church tended to, for 2,000 years, worship like sky gods and so forth. And people are going to hear me always saying like 2,000 years after the incarnation, maybe we're called to be something different. But a lot of us realize that, when we say Dostoevsky saw further than many of the church fathers, for sure he did, because he was talking about the inner world of all of us. So the quote from Rilke is, perhaps all the dragons in our lives are princesses who are only waiting to see us act just once with beauty and courage. Perhaps everything that frightens us is, in its deepest essence, something helpless that wants our love. So let's take the microcosm of our own psychology and let's talk about the whole world explored by, say, Sigmund Freud and Dostoevsky. We don't think that has been brought, I don't think it's been brought into the Catholic consciousness quite enough. Now, a lot of it is bad. There's pop Freudianism. Could be a Jung cult as well as the great insights of Jung. But on the other hand, I think there's a direct analogy. Young people, if they're listening, Joe Rogan is having these people on who've taken their plant-based medicines and they're seeing these kind of gray creatures. And this guy, Stephen Clark, reading about the Mexican mysteries, when I read him well, he's saying that the same thing is going on at the macrocosmic level. We've turned people away from the underworld just by saying it's hell and it's all bad, where there's a lot of creatures down there that need to be redeemed, just like those ghosts in us. That I tell students all the time, that thing, that voice in you that's scaring you so much, it could just be something that needs your attention and love. But there's this, it opens up to me that could be the charism of American Catholicism for the next 2,000 years. I think the impulse could be leading to this continent, and under the patronage of Our Lady of Guadalupe, who is much more than Mexico. Right. I think she's the patroness. America is dedicated to Mary in her Immaculate Conception, but she's the patroness of America. How do you enter this whole notion of the underworld, which is something I want to explore, but all I know is what I don't know about it. Do you know if there's any people? So I'm sharing my interest for a future episode.
Well, actually, let's plug next week's show. Next week,
Martin Shaw
will be Martin Shaw, and he'll be a great person to talk to about that. Okay. But actually, I've been thinking about this a lot, because the underworld. What is the underworld? Well, in one way, you could say it's the things we're unconscious of or we're avoiding, right? But it's also the body. It's the deepest part of materiality in a way, right? Where you go in
the body of the earth, right?
Yeah. Right. And I'm a guy, I'm a farmer, right? So I'm interested in that dynamic between the solar and the earthly, right? I work with it every day. In fact, this weekend I'm having a biodynamic farming and gardening workshop here at the farm, and either depends if it rains tonight, we won't do it tonight, but if it does, we'll do it tomorrow. We're going to dig up the cow horns.
Fun.
Yep. Buried last fall, and which is precisely working with those kinds of energies. But I think psychologically, what you're addressing there is, and you're right, and I think we've seen this through Catholic theology, Orthodox theology, is the emphasis, the unspoken preference for celibacy, or the heavenly, or the angelic over the earthly, right? Mm-hmm. And how many times, even in Catholic and Orthodox circles, certainly in Protestant circles, do we hear the phrase, the earth is not our real home?
Wow.
Right?
Yep.
Bullshit. You don't have to be too mentally acute to read the Bible from the cover to cover and figure out that, yes, it is.
Or again, if you're often quoting it, but if people just needed a symbol of that, it's like Sergius Bulgakov on the Eucharist, the blood of Christ that flowed, right?
Exactly.
So let's start paying attention to the earth, folks. Yeah.
But I think that's interesting. I mean, all these stories of the heroes in mythology who have to go into the underworld, right? Orpheus, you mentioned earlier, right? But there are many others, and it's coming exactly what I think what happens when we go into the underworld. We come, or at least, maybe not totally come to terms, but we begin to come to terms with all of those things, and sex is one of them, right? Mm-hmm. And by not going into that underworld, what happens is those creatures are still there and overwhelm us.
Become our puppet masters, right?
Yeah. And those forces, right? Those forces overcome us and overwhelm us. And like you said, that quote from Rilke, right? Maybe it's really a princess. Well, it's Sophia, right? It's Sophia who needs to be released from her sleep, right? Sleeping.
Beauty, it's there. Yep.
In our interview with David Bentley Hart, whenever it was earlier this year or into last year.
Totally relevant.
That's in his book, Canogaia. It's precisely what that story is. He based that book on the Gnostic Hymn of the Pearl, which is the retrieval. Basically, it's the retrieval of Sophia, or the retrieval of our real personhood from the darkness and from forgetfulness. Yeah. From forgetfulness, because we forget why we're here.
One of the things that, Rudolf Steiner, he's weird, but he can be super, super tantalizing. People become cultists with him. We all know that whole thing. But one of the interesting tidbits he dropped in these Mexican mysteries about the American land was that, and I think I love this so much, so I'll kind of give the punchline first, but that maybe the first 2,000 years of European Catholicism, mostly based there, you have the story of the mother and child to the Mater Dolorosa, right? We're moving in that direction. But this brokenness, the underworld, that the American Catholic charism will be from the Mater Dolorosa to healing again, because I can't shut up about the theme of healing, that when we go to the underworld, we're going, and that he would even say, this is where it gets more esoteric and occult, is that just like Herod tried to prevent the birth of Christ, there was something happened, and I'm reading all about, Teotihuacan, this Mexican civilization that really sprung out of nowhere like a mushroom in first century Mexico. And there were precursors to that. So you get a sense that on the American land somewhere, there was an attempt made, and this is shielded by great mystery for Steiner. There was an attempt made to interfere with the mysteries of Christ's death. And that a great initiate tried to stop him, but there were these forces that allowed it to continue. And that in the American land, again, that healing of coming from death, where we're feeling enslaved, to restoration, that could be the theme for the next 2,000 years. And for me, that's very hopeful, right? 2,000 years isn't enough, and we can start celebrating that this notion from that underworld to these shadows, the doubles, working with those, terra incognita, starting to go there under the patronage of the divine feminine, specifically on this continent, Our Lady of Guadalupe. I want to explore this a lot next year in what other ways we can. Martin Shaw can help us unpack it.
Well, it's interesting you mention that, because I don't know, I didn't tell you about this, but I've been working on this volume of poetry forever.
Is this all your poetry, or is it an anthology too, or all?
No, it's mine. It's all mine.
Very cool.
But the working title of the collection is Mythologies, and it started off with me looking at kind of the myths and legends that have kind of informed who I am. So part of it was the story of Lancelot and King Arthur is in there, because the older I get, the more and more I realize the Mort d'Arthur by Thomas Malory is kind of the foundational text for who I am. But it started off with that, and actually seeing a lot of the things I do here on the farm and through my life in mythological terms or in folkloric terms, right? But it's more and more it's taken a turn toward what you're talking about with this journey to the underworld, right? And coming to terms with, actually, I think in a way, one of the guiding metaphors of this collection is the Great Pan, right? Because I'm really fascinated, and I write about this in what book? In Sophia in Exile, I have a chapter on the great underappreciated poet and writer Eleanor Fargen, and she uses Pan. In fact, one of her first books is called Pan Worship. It's a volume of poetry, but for her, Pan is a metaphor for Christ. And at the time she was writing this stuff, she wasn't even a Christian yet. And even though she wasn't a Christian, she wrote all these wonderful lyrics that ended up on the Anglican hymnal. Like probably most famous, "Morning is Broken."
Morning is Broken, yeah.
Which is, if you really pay attention to those lyrics, they are extraordinary.
Absolutely, that was a great article too.
and a
great chapter of your book. I'm sorry.
Yeah. Well, no, so I noticed more and more as I'm going through this, it's probably psychologically helpful for me too, but to come, and this is what I write in there, I think, with Fargen drawing on that, and I think this is certainly inhabiting my consciousness in the writing of these poems, is that the story I tell in there, and I can't remember which Roman it was, but at the time of the crucifixion, there was a sailor in the Mediterranean who heard a voice come across the sea, and it said, "The Great Pan is dead."
That's Rabelais. I'll send you
No,
the
it's not
chapter.
Rabelais.
Oh no, okay.
It was a Latin. It was a
Okay.
ancient Latin, classical
Oh, so
Latin.
he's probably just quoting that, but he
Yes.
extrapolates on that in his fourth book. I'll send it to you. It's super.
Yeah.
It's central in all of world literature.
But anyway, so the great Pan is dead, and so I think it was Bede or one of the early church historians. Can't remember who it was. He was interpreting that as saying that this voice was saying that the Roman god Pan was dead, right, with the crucifixion. But others were interpreting it as saying that whoever this voice belonged to, or whatever spirit this voice belonged to, is that when they witnessed Christ die on the cross, that that was the great Pan who was dead. It was a horrifying to witness the source of life, because that's what Pan means, all, right?
Yep.
So that was it, and it didn't anticipate the resurrection, but that was the announcement. And I think that's an unexplored territory in Christian theology.
Yeah.
And I think part and parcel of that.
Say more. Say that. It's so crucial. Say that key point again. When you say it's unexplored,
it's unexplored.
But say what's the thing?
That god of the underworld.
Yeah.
Or the god of the countryside, the god of the peasantry.
And it's there. Pan is also pane, Bruce, it's just bread, but everything,
Right, but it's the all, right? The all.
Yeah.
And this is what St. Paul says. We are all and in all, the pleroma, right?
Mm-hmm.
Christ is all and in all, right? I mean, could it be any more plainly spoken? Christ is all and in all. And I think Pan is a god of fertility, but not of sexual license.
Right. And fecundity.
Fertility is super important to me. Of course, I have 9 children, but it's also, as a farmer, nothing is more important than fertility and ensuring fertility and working with nature to ensure that fertility as much as one can.
Oh.
Right. And I think, I've said it before, but I'll say it again. I think what we see right now with this trans bizarreness, and even, did you see this story? This just came out this week, that some drug company is developing a vaccine, they're calling it, that will prevent women from getting pregnant.
Wow. No.
That's not, it's like treating pregnancy like a disease, treating fertility as a disease.
Right.
And that's the world in which we live. And I think you could say, though it's not explicitly stated, but I think in practice it unfolds this way, is the emphasis through church history on celibacy and elevating the clergy above the laity, even though everybody's going to tell you that's not how it was meant, but it's how it worked out, right?
Right.
And I think all the stuff we see right now is a direct, but kind of by circuitous means, result of that. Of that, and also of. And then you see this. So you go back to the Middle Ages, when the cult of Mary begins, right, in earnest. That was not something the church hierarchy said, "Hey, let's push Mary."
Right.
That came from the ground up. That came from the laity up, right? So those kinds of things, and I think we were talking earlier, So I think, I don't know how this would happen, but I think the salvation would come from the bottom up.
I was just going to say that you mentioned Orpheus. There's this great musical, Hadestown. People need to listen to it again and again, but the church is schizophrenic on this issue, right? I mentioned Patrick Deneen earlier, but some years ago, I don't know, 15, he might have had an article in First Things, but I used it when I used to teach humanities, that hopefully one of the things that the Regeneration Podcast can do, and I think maybe by focusing on the underworld and nature, is to help hear this stupid political divide, because he showed, the Republicans would say, you can't do anything to mess with the fertility of this body, and don't change this into a male or a female. No way. But if you're conservatives, you can look at that mountain over there and say, yeah, you can turn that into a field, and you can put all the chemicals you want into that thing. That's no problem, right? And the liberals would say, you can change this, male, female, regulate fertility here, but you must protect pristine nature. You wouldn't mess with her at all.
Yeah, it's the most bizarre thing, right?
Yeah, that is a bizarre thing, right? And it's so illustrative. And it also made me think of, the Orthodox, you're a poet and a poet collector, Philip Sherrard, right? His book, The Rape of Man and Nature, that the church, the official pronouncements of the church probably tend to lean, Pope Francis is trying to redress this, to his credit, probably tend to lean too much on the awareness of this nature, the body. Don't put chemicals to regulate fertility in here, and don't change male to female. We haven't done enough. But the point is, we can't do one without the other. We can't do one without the other. And so the church, in focusing on this one, when you mentioned that virus, it struck me, the word that came to me is like a rape, right? Or something, but the rape of man and nature, but we're still allowing this kind of technocratic view of nature out there. And, unless the church can bring two of these together, it is speaking just gibberish. It's speaking gibberish.
Absolutely. Yep. Absolutely. And because I think what we see is, under the guise of environmentalism, it's just another kind of exploitation.
Right.
And you can see, because as you point out, if you look out to nature, into the human, and then to human nature, that's the other thing they're trying to colonize right now, as we speak. Right. And it's perverse in almost all regards. And people are afraid to say anything about it, and the people who, and I was telling Bonnie this the other day. I said, it's easy in this environment, this technocratic environment that, where we get most of our news from social media, to despair and like, oh my, there's no hope. Right. Like watching what's come out about the FBI over the last few weeks. And my God, are we the most corrupt nation on earth in history?
Wild.
But on the other hand, I told Bonnie, I said, no, I think there's still hope, because there are people that we could, that's the thing, is right now we want to categorize everything as left or right, right? But there are people left and right. I mean, I've been kind of excited about Robert F. Kennedy Jr. because I haven't been interested in a Democratic politician for since his uncle, or since his father. Right? I mean, a long time.
Surprise people, because a lot of people are just going to go, who we just thought like nothing good could come from Nazareth. A lot of Trump supporters, young, they're pretty smart. They're just going to be with him so quick, and it's going to upset the political calculus. It doesn't mean he's going to win, but the world, the elite, whatever we want to call it, want to think that everybody who is with kind of Donald Trump, very few of him, well, all of them knew he was a stooge, but they also knew that he was a threat in some way. But when a certain faction of our population sees those young people or whomever just so easily float their support because those same themes are over with Kennedy, better articulate, I hope it's going to upset the political calculus.
Yeah, me too. What's good about it, not just him, I mean, but there are other people out there like Naomi Wolf and Jimmy Dore, people who Glenn Greenwald.
Awesome. Yep.
There are people who are, would have, I don't know what they would. I don't think you could describe them as left or anything now. But a few years ago, they would have described themselves as progressive or lefties, right? They won't do it now because they're not stupid and they're honest with themselves, right? And I think there's hope that I mean, even though we're not presented with that picture, and these are the people who were shut down by the social media, by the FBI, basically through social media over the last few years, right? Joe Rogan. Remember what they did? Remember that bizarre thing with Joe Rogan when he got COVID and took ivermectin and whatever else he took, and it was like they let the attack dogs out on him. It was like Birmingham in the 50s, It was
when you mentioned both leftism and progressivism, the word that our friend Guido uses a lot, which might have a future, is dissent, right? We can say that's an essay or a book. What happened to dissent? That when leftism doesn't have any part of dissent to it. In fact, the word dissent seems to be the opposite of what constitutes the political, quote unquote, Democratic Party of the left right now. That the word that might help organize people with like an RFK presidency. And so far, listen, neither Michael or I are calling him a martyr right now, but a great writer, this Charles Eisenstein, definitely a man of dissent. He just kind of signed on with the Kennedy campaign, but it's something to watch for sure. I think that's what we're both saying. But one of the hopes that could crystallize around him is that people could rally under a notion of dissent again, which are the real progressives, the real left.
But it's also, I mean, with him in particular, but even with those figures I mentioned, it's refreshing to hear people not just repeating the master narrative.
Yep.
Right. And not only that, but to he's really articulate. I mean, Kennedy in particular, but all those people I mentioned are really articulate in a way that I thought was gone forever. Because when I teach rhetoric, for instance, in college, I'll often show the mountaintop speech by Martin Luther King. And I say, well, first of all those allusions to the Bible, you guys don't get. So let me explain what he was talking about with the mountaintop. But the other part of it is that, I say, where have you heard in political life anybody this articulate?
It's embarrassing.
And Robert Kennedy, if you look at there was something that came up recently across social media of John Kennedy, some speech he gave. I'm like, Jesus, what happened to this level of discourse?
And we'll have to have. Remember when one of our hedge school things, we'll have Tom, our friend Thomas Jude Germanario, back on again. He did one on astrology that was great, and he's great on JFK. Let's do one on JFK and the unspeakable. Because the unspeakable is a theological category. You and I both want to. All of a sudden these things turn against themselves. Go ahead.
Well, that was one of the hedge school conversations we had. Somebody mentioned whether the CIA took out Kennedy, right?
Oh, like of course they did.
Wasn't that well, at that time though, we didn't want to publish it on the internet. Now everybody's like, well, yeah.
Okay, right. You're right. Yeah,
that was afraid that they were going to come after it, but no, it's damn near common knowledge.
We were speaking axiomatically as if that was taken for granted. Yeah, back then. Maybe some those will be like the 15 years from now. We'll keep on alluding to those hedge school discussions and people want to pay for them, right? Like it was the early underground tapes of what later became the Regeneration Podcast.
You want the vintage stuff? We would give you the Regeneration.
I'll tell you this, we got to have TJ back too. I had some technological problems. He was on early and he had some drawings, but that guy is a genius. And he's another mind we can tap this year on the poetry of Dante, on usury, on all ancient mythology and new, on the underworld, on the divine feminine. So we'll weave him in again. He's a funny guy. So Michael, if we are saying, are we going to do this thing for another year? I'm saying like raise a glass. We'll do this thing. We'll continue on as long as it's useful. We do ask people to leave their comments. One thing, my youngest came home from college. I looked at our YouTube demographics. You and I, we've never talked about this. We haven't tried to target something. We do talk about a concern we have with, the world that the young people would be inheriting right now, but we haven't deliberately tried to make ourselves relevant to young people. But I'll mention kind of a disappointment to me is that our demographics are, they're still pretty strongly over 50 and so forth. And I'm gonna work on the theory of my youngest, who unsolicited told me, Dad, these things you're doing are good, but you need to do what anybody else does on YouTube, is take some segments, break them down into like 2-minute key highlight segments. And so that's a courtesy that I hope to offer to some of our listeners, is that we have these kind of long form talk, but hopefully in the new year. I told my son, he just came home from college, he won't be living with us for long. I said, do some of that. You seem to have a strong opinion about it. And I'll let you live, I'll float you some money. And of course, you're living at home. So like, give your dad a solid, yeah. Well, and so I want to alert. And again, people use the comments on things you'd like to hear. But we know we're going to take a trip to the Underworld. I think we already have, but we'll go deeper on that. And I've had a great time, Michael, so far this year. Here's to year number 2 with the Regeneration Podcast. Concluding thoughts for you.
Yeah,
what are you doing this weekend?
Are we going to go into the Underworld? Or are we going to hell in a handbasket? That's the question.
Yeah, we'll find.
But yeah, this has been a lot of fun. I mean, this whole year, I'm going to look forward to our discussions every Friday morning.
Yeah, and thanks.
Thank all the people we talked to.
Yeah, who send letters. Yeah, we haven't done much to promote ourselves. We've actually heard it with my technological mediocrity, and yet every week I see that we've gained. We've never even say. Have we once told people like spread the word? It's never come out.
No, I gotta say one more thing.
Yeah, do it.
Because I don't know. I remember I mentioned to you, not on the podcast, but privately, that I was worried that I was too toxic a figure for us to get our message out on the podcast. Because, and I just actually got a phone call a week and a half ago from a friend of mine who's about to be ordained as an Episcopalian priest or a deacon, and then a priest in 6 months. And he talked about a mutual friend of ours who said, Mike, when you get on that vaccine stuff, man, it really hits some people in the fields, and they don't want to even deal with you anymore. And the one interview we did that was taken down by YouTube was our interview with Dr. James Thorpe, right?
Yeah.
I talked to him, probably the most personal podcast for me this past year, because it affected my family, what we talked about. And so I gotta hand it to you, Mike, because you're associating with known felons in a way.
Funny.
And I'm sure, I don't know if it's happened, but I gotta wonder if people have questioned your sanity by hanging out with me.
Oh no. You have I love strong personalities. And we see the world the same way. But it's funny you say that. But yeah, you're a character. I've enjoyed it so much. But there's no way change is gonna come. I think we're both working. Like I said, we've never necessarily even asked for subscribers, but like we can ask now, like spread the word to your friends. If you like what you're hearing, tell your friends about the Regeneration Podcast. Because I know for both of us, this is a mission. We're not saying like urgently we have to save the world, but unless people just start kind of sharing what they see as true in that given day. And if some people think that like we'd be afraid to have somebody on some issue to come on, because I always tell people like on some of this, like I think of our friend Guido, who's pretty controversial too. Somebody could say like what he says about World War II is crazy. I'm like, hi, come on the podcast. We'll have Guido on. You can talk to him. And I feel the same way, that if somebody said like, you guys are so cocky on this issue, you wouldn't dare talk to this person, I think you would agree with me, Mike. Send us that person's name. We'd love to have him on the show, because neither of us care about owning anybody. We're just trying to pursue the truth. And boy, I hope people hear that. I hope they don't hear us trying to like school people who aren't here. And so I do want to say, if some people knows of some scholar on some field that has a completely different take, you and I disagree on some things, or I don't know if we disagree so much as we get at things from different angles. Yeah. But I think I speak for you that I'd say, gosh, I'd like to have that person on.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, as you know, I mean, I don't know if you noticed this about me, but I don't like to attack people when we talk to them. No. I just think it's not cool. When I watch podcasts, when people go after the guest, I just think that's the most uncool thing you could do. Yeah. Right.
Yeah. But anybody who came on who differed, there would be hopefully.
Well, people differ with us. I mean, Paul.
The model of civility. The model of civility.
I differed with Paul Kingsnorth, for instance, on a couple of things, but
me too.
It was nothing. It wasn't worth dying for, or, you know what I mean?
The one, and again, I think he was great. We're just reminiscing a little bit, because we now had the King's coronation, and I really enjoyed that. Mark Vernon, we're going to have him on again. Yeah. But he and John Milbank, all these people who live in Britain, they just kind of love the monarchy so much.
I know. I don't get it either.
I don't get it. I don't get it.
I'm over here going, oh, yeah.
I heard the homily at the coronation. Anglican Mass was just stunning. And then, Charles got to pick the readings. We both have something good to say about Charles, King Charles, but he got to choose the readings. That it was Isaiah, today in your presence, it was the Jesus reading when he comes into the temple, the scroll he proclaimed, and so he chose that, and that the preaching on that. But then I just want to say to people like Mark Vernon and John Milbank, do you guys realize that the British Empire has heard this thing for 120 years, and they've done the opposite? They seem to have the American. Yeah.
Well, and that's why I can't wait for Guido's book to come out.
Yeah, right.
Church and Empire, because it's a lot about the Anglo-American Empire.
Yeah.
Right, and exactly, and since I wrote the forward to that, maybe it was in the fall.
Your forward's great, and then I don't even know how to edit my own sentences, but I edited that little abbreviated book for him, as well as he has he's got an abbreviated book of Conjuring Hitler coming out, and then a small booklet he wrote on called Phantasmagoria, and it's on the American time in Afghanistan, tying to 9/11. And sad but true, if people are wondering what he thinks about Building 7, he doesn't really go there. He's not avoiding it in any way, but he wants to say this whole peculiar saga that had us involved with the Taliban and then just pulling out. And he thinks he can connect the dots there for us. Yep.
And he's good at that.
He's very good. Yep. So we'll have him on again very soon.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thanks everybody. Thanks for listening. And again, obviously some of you are spreading the word because again, we just see our subscribers. We're our own worst advertisers. They grow. I don't know, Michael, they've grown 20 people this week, and up to
our best.
People who know me know I'm not lying. I don't know how to shill for myself.
Despite our best intentions. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Thanks everybody for listening to the Regeneration Podcast. Next week looks to be special. Maybe we'll start this dive into the underworld with guest Martin Shaw, a name known to many. So we'll see you then and there. Thanks everybody. Bye.